In the spring of the 13th year of the Tian Ji era of the Tang Empire, Viking welcomed a long-awaited spring rain. Located at the northwest frontier of the empire, this military stronghold had been built with sturdy earth walls to fend off the invasions of the nomadic tribes from the grasslands. The walls were thick and appeared as solid earth embankments. During dry seasons, the loose dirt on the walls would be swept away by the northwest wind, scattering into the air. Dust would settle on the rudimentary barracks and the soldiers, and the entire city would be enveloped in a yellowish haze. At night, when people unfolded their bedding to sleep, sandstorms would often stir up. However, this timely spring rain brought a long mist freshness. Since last night, the gentle rain had washed the dust off the rooftops, as if it had also cleared people's vision, making everything appear more vivid. For Ma Shixiang, the highest military officer of Viking, the world before him seemed particularly bright. Although he was displeased by the muddy footprints on the guest carpet, he cleverly hid his displeasure behind a perfectly measured expression of surprise. Inside the tent, he respectfully bowed to the elderly, ragged man and quietly asked, "Esteemed elder, is there anything else you require? If you plan to depart tomorrow, I can arrange for 100-strong escort. I can immediately send the orders to the military department." The elderly man smiled gently, pointed to several figures in the tent, and lightly shook his head, indicating that there was nothing else needed. Just then, a cold, arrogant voice from within the tent spoke out, "No need. Just take care of your business." When the convoy entered Viking through the rain in the morning, Ma Shixiang quickly deduced the identity of the noble guest. He had already recognized the coldness and pride in her demeanor and dared not speak further. After a brief silence in the tent, the woman spoke again. "The mountain roads from Viking to the capital along the Min Mountains are rough. If this rain continues, some roads may be damaged. You should arrange for a guide from the army." Ma Shixiang paused for a moment, a certain unpleasant thought flashing through his mind. After a brief silence, he lowered his head and replied, "There is already someone suitable." Outside the barracks, several officers exchanged glances, their expressions complex. Some were regretful, some reluctant, some relieved, and some shocked. But clearly, no one had expected Ma Shixiang to choose that person as the guide for the noble guest. "General, are you really going to let him go like this?" one of the officers asked in surprise. Although Viking was small, with only about 300 officers and soldiers in the military camp, it was far from prosperous and often gave the impression of a bandit hideout. The so-called general was nothing more than a low-ranking deputy general. However, Ma Shixiang was strict with his military discipline, or rather, he preferred others to call him general. As a result, even in everyday conversations, his subordinates always made sure to address him as general. Ma Shixiang wiped the rainwater from his face and glanced around at the pools of water accumulating around the barracks. He sighed softly, "I can't just keep him here in this godforsaken place. The reply for his recommendation letter has been sitting here for almost half a year. The boy has a bright future ahead of him, since he's on his way to the capital for the academy's preliminary exams, and a noble guest convoy happens to be passing through. It wouldn't hurt to send him along as a favor. But I don't think the noble will appreciate it. Double quotes, another officer replied indignantly. At this moment, the door of the barracks was pushed open, and a delicate-looking maid stepped out. She coldly looked at Ma Shixiang and the others and said, "Take me to see the guide." The chamberlains of prime ministers, the maids of noble households, and the royal guests are some of the most troublesome figures in the bureaucracy. They are both close and resented, and staying distant might bring about trouble. They are the hardest to deal with. Ma Shixiang felt a deep weariness towards such people. He didn't want to say much to her, so after exchanging a few pleasantries, he waved a call over an officer and instructed him to take the maid to find the guide. The rain temporarily stopped, and Viking, after the spring rain, looked especially fresh. A few branches of the desert willows by the street had started to sprout tender green leaves. Though the scenery was pleasant, Viking was simply too small. After a short walk, the officer led the maid to their destination, a simple yet lively barracks. The noise from inside, filled with shouting, scolding, and orders, caused the maid to furrow her brow slightly, feeling displeased. She thought to herself, could someone really be drinking in the barracks in broad daylight? As the door curtain was lifted by the wind, the sounds became clearer. Indeed, they were playing dice, but it wasn't any formal drinking game. Upon hearing the words spoken, the maid's delicate face flushed with both embarrassment and anger, and she couldn't help but clench her fist inside her sleeve. We're playing the lusty dice. Who's lusty? You're lusty. Who's lusty? I'm lusty. Who's lusty? He's lusty. The filthy sounds of the dice game echoed continuously, the noise persistent, with no clear winner even after a long time. The maid's expression grew increasingly unpleasant, her brows tightly furrowed. Unable to hold back any longer, she lifted a corner of the door curtain and sharply scanned the room. At first glance, her eyes landed on a young boy sitting across from the table. The boy appeared to be around 15 or 16 years old, wearing the standard military cotton tunic commonly seen in the barracks, the front of which was stained with grease. His hair was dark and shiny, though it was unclear whether it was naturally curly or simply greasy from lack of washing. Yet, surprisingly, his face looked remarkably clean, with distinct features, and a few freckles on his cheeks stood out sharply. Who's lusty? You're lusty. In stark contrast to the filthy nature of the dice game, the boy's expression was focused and serious, showing no trace of lasciviousness. On the contrary, his eyebrows and eyes conveyed a sense of almost sacred nobility. His right hand moved swiftly, making gestures for rock, paper, scissors, his punches like the wind, and his movements carrying a murderous intent, as if winning or losing this game of dice was more important than life itself. Several persistent green flies, undeterred by the harsh northwest environment, continuously attempted to land on the boy's grease-stained tunic, but were always driven away by his rapid punches and sharp gestures. I win. After a long, drawn-out game of dice that seemed as though it could suck all the air out of the lungs of the two players at the table, the dark-haired boy suddenly swung his right arm with excitement, announcing his victory with a beaming smile, a charming dimple appearing on his left cheek. However, the boy's opponent was not willing to accept defeat. He insisted that the boy's punch had changed direction when he shouted, "Who's lusty?" at the end. The room immediately descended into a heated argument, with each side stubbornly defending their own view, neither willing to concede. Just then, someone suddenly shouted, according to the old rule, "Listen to Sang Sang." All eyes turned toward a corner of the room, where an 11 or 12-year-old girl was moving a water bucket. She was small, thin, with dark skin, and an ordinary face. The maid's clothes she wore were clearly borrowed from someone else, too large for her, the hem dragging on the ground, making her movements appear clumsy. She struggled to carry a water bucket heavier than herself, her actions clearly labored. The little maid, named Sang Sang, set the water bucket down and turned around. The soldiers watched her intently, their eyes filled with expectation, as though they were gamblers waiting for the dealer to announce the final result. From their reactions, it was clear that this scene was not the first of its kind. The little maid furrowed her brows, first glancing at the boy, then turning to the soldier across the table, still visibly upset. She spoke seriously. "In the 23rd round, you threw scissors, he threw rock, but you shouted he's lusty, so you already lost at that moment." A burst of laughter erupted in the room, and the atmosphere lightened. Everyone began to disperse, and the soldier muttered a curse under his breath before handing over the bet. The boy happily took the money, wiped the grease stains from his chest with his hand, and patted the soldier on the shoulder, his face full of smiles as he offered words of consolation. "Cheer up. In all of Viking no, in the whole world, who can beat me? Ning Que." The maid's expression immediately darkened, and the officer who had been keeping an eye on her noticed, his face turning grim. He gripped the door curtain tightly, took a deep breath, and was about to clear his throat and offer a quiet reminder when he was stopped by two sharp glares from the maid. She ignored the officer's reaction, her gaze fixed on the boy and the maid as they left the barracks, remaining silent and observing their every movement. The officer stared at her back, filled with confusion, unable to understand what she intended to do. He could only attribute her strange behavior to the usual caution and eccentricities of someone close to the noble guest. Throughout the journey, the boy named Ning Que did not show anything particularly unusual. He casually bought some food and greeted the plump woman at a street-side tavern, appearing relaxed and at ease. However, the maid's expression grew increasingly darker. The only thing that felt off to her was that the small maid behind Ning Que was struggling to drag a water bucket, yet the boy made no move to offer assistance. Although the empire had a rigid class system, the people were still relatively simple and down to earth. In a lavish and shadowy place like the capital, Chang'an, even the most indifferent noble should not be unmoved upon seeing an 11 or 12-year-old frail girl struggling with such a heavy burden. Is it allowed for soldiers to keep maids? The maid forced herself to suppress the anger rising in her chest and coldly asked the officer beside her. The officer scratched his head, paused for a moment, and then replied, "A few years ago, there was a severe drought in Hebei, and groups of refugees flooded southward and to the border regions, with corpses littering the roads. I heard that Sang was saved by Ning Que from a pile of dead bodies back then. Ning Que himself is an orphan, and since then, the two of them have been relying on each other." He paused again, then cautiously continued. Later, he enlisted in the army, and his only condition was to bring this little girl to Viking. Although everyone knows that the army doesn't allow this, their situation was different. They couldn't just drive a child to the brink of despair. So, everyone turned a blind eye. Hearing the officer's explanation, the maid's expression softened slightly. However, when she saw Ning Que leisurely strolling along, holding half a roasted chicken, and then turned to see the small maid struggling several meters behind, dragging the water bucket with her face turning bright red, her mood instantly darkened again. She coldly said, "This is not relying on each other for survival. He's clearly toying with that girl's life." Viking was small, and it didn't take long before the four of them arrived at a south-facing cottage. Outside the house was a simple little stone yard, surrounded by a fence. The maid and the officer stood outside the fence, their eyes fixed on the interior of the house. The small maid struggled to move a water bucket nearly as tall as she was, placing it beside the water barrel. She then stepped onto a stool, exerting all her strength to pour the water into the barrel. Afterward, she began washing rice and vegetables, and while the rice steamed, she picked up a cloth to wipe down the tables, chairs, and windows. Soon, the room was filled with steam, and the frail girl became enveloped in the mist, appearing even smaller and lonelier. Although it had rained last night, the rain was light, and the yellow dust on the windows and doors hadn't been completely washed away. Instead, the water had left unsightly muddy streaks. The small maid took a cloth and skillfully and quickly wiped away the stains. The house and yard were instantly transformed, becoming clean and bright. Clearly, these chores were something she did every day, and her movements were now very practiced. The little black maid worked diligently like an ant, running here and there. Her clothes were soaked with sweat, and her cheeks were flushed, making her look both somewhat comical and, at the same time, evoking a sense of sympathy.